All right, welcome everybody. I was just reading in the news that a number of universities, Harvard, MIT, Princeton, Stanford, have just begun free online courses open to everyone. And so I think this is our first kind of contribution to that effort, because we are essentially kind of an open seminar today, ungrounded in some sense, although the political theory workshop has been nice enough to host us. And open to everyone, obviously packed, and so this is a good sign. On behalf of the University of Chicago, welcome Professor François Ewald and Professor Gary Becker to discuss Foucault's lectures on American neoliberalism. This open seminar is fortuitous. Professor François Ewald was invited to the University of Chicago by 3CT, the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, for a conference on the future of risk. Along with Patrick O'Malley from the University of Sydney and Caitlin Zulum from NYU. And there are some brochures about the conference, which is on Friday at the I House, and I encourage you to come join us. It should be fascinating. As you know well, François Ewald holds the chair in insurance studies at the Conservatoire National des Arts et Métiers and is the director of the Ecole nationale d'assurance. Professor Ewald was also, importantly, Michel Foucault's principal assistant and interlocutor at the Collège de France from 1976 to 1984, and the founder of the Michel Foucault Centre, and has been responsible for the publication of Foucault's work with Daniel Defer. When I realized that Professor Ewald would be at the University of Chicago with us, I immediately wrote to Gary Becker, Professor Gary Becker, our most illustrious and accomplished professor in economics and sociology, and of course a recipient of the Nobel Prize, and asked him whether he'd be interested in discussing Foucault's writings on Gary Becker. As you know, in a series of important lectures delivered in 1979 under the title The Birth of Biopolitics, Michel Foucault engaged Gary Becker's work within the context of an elaboration and critique of different kinds of neoliberalism. And he was specifically, in those three lectures, 9, 10, and 11, looking at American neoliberalism as opposed to German ordoliberalism and French neoliberalism. Professor Becker immediately responded that he would be happy to read Foucault's lectures and come to discuss Foucault's work. And here I should just interject that I think this is precisely what makes the University of Chicago so remarkable, this willingness to read and engage critical work, which reflects how deeply I think we value the life of the mind and ideas here in Chicago. And I'll say it's precisely why I dedicated my last book, which is a critique of the Chicago School, to Gary Becker, precisely for being such an extraordinary and open colleague, open to ideas, exchange, and critique. As a teaser for this seminar, I will tell you that in a glorious email that Professor Becker sent to me the day before yesterday, Gary Becker wrote, "I like most of it," referring to Michel Foucault's, "I like most of it, and I do not agree with much. I also cannot tell whether..."
Disagree with
I don't disagree with much. Did I say that? Is that Freudian, perhaps? No, okay. I'll slow down and repeat this. I like most of it, and I do not disagree with much. I also cannot tell whether Foucault is disagreeing with me. Okay? That truly sets the tone for this historic conversation. So I will ask François Ewald to start with the historical and intellectual context of Foucault's lectures. Before turning it over to Gary Becker for his reactions, I may intervene. I will ask Chris Burke, a brilliant doctoral student in political theory, also to intervene before we open up the seminar to discussion. Of course, we're in Chicago, so some people don't always wait before intervening. One final remark: several colleagues couldn't be here and asked that I record the open seminar, and so I will be doing that through various mechanisms that may or may not work. I'm not sure. So let's get started. But before we do, are there more chairs or anything? Or
one chair.
There's one chair back here, so feel free to come on up. At least one person.
I'm the one who will write me melting, but I don't know if like.
Okay. All right. Well, let's wait until the lawnmowers have stopped doing the midway for a second, and then we'll open up the windows. Okay. François Ewald.
Yes. Thanks, Bernard, for this invitation. maybe the moment will be very hard for you because my English is so bad. That is a pity. So bad English with a so great professor.
Your English is a lot better than my French.
So I try to make my job, that is to remember the, in my view, that is not, I want to say what Foucault would say if he was here. So that is my view. So we have, I will try to explain this paradox, how it was possible that an intellectual, that a philosopher, a French philosopher, maybe famous like a left French philosopher, a radical, makes at the end of 70s a lecture in the Collège de France where he makes the apology of neoliberalism, and especially the apology of Gary Becker, which is known in the book the most radical representative of the American neoliberalism. What is interesting to understand that is how it was possible that such kind of French philosopher embark Gary Becker in a story which is, in fact, a story of trust. Because the relationship between Foucault and Gary Becker is a relation in the respect of trust-telling. And that is what is interesting. In this perspective, I think we don't have to think that the interest for Foucault was the liberalism. I think he was interested, but not to the liberalism like an ideology, but he was very interested in the liberalism like not in ideology, not like a philosophy, but because liberalism was for him an epistemology. And what I think, what was Foucault was interested in your work because he was interested in your manner to think, not what were your conviction. What was your conviction? Maybe that is the reason because Foucault has not searched to meet you. That is not your person, but your work. Was important. So, what was? I will explain my position with maybe 4 remarks. The first one, that is the French context. We were in France still in the aftermath of May 68, you know, and that was a time of liberation. And the big question was how it was possible to think outside of the old framework of thinking in France. We searched to be free with the past. And that is the reason, because it could be possible to be interested by such questions like liberalism or economy, American economy, and so on. But that is a historical context. In fact, Foucault, you know, that was a challenge in France to give the true interpretation of the event of 68. In 72, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari gave her own interpretation with a theory of désir. And the Foucault response comes later in 75 with Discipline and Punish, and the Foucault's interpretation was the question put in the agenda in May 68 is the power, is the question of power and the relationship, the power relationship. And the people, politician, philosopher, historian in France asked to question, yes, but with your theory of micropower, it will be impossible for you to give a state theory, a theory of the state. And the response in this lecture, you have the response of Foucault on this question. And the Foucault response, the Foucault's response is, we don't need a state theory, but we need a theory of government. State is not at the core of the political question. What is at the core of political question? That is a question of government, of governmentality. And he searched, and he proposed a story of governmentality during 2 years of his lecture in the Collège de France. And the second year was dedicated to the modern governmentality, that is a governmentality when the true telling of the government is given by economics. And that is the definition for Foucault of liberalism. So, that is a game, the Foucault's game. Very hard question in France, in the French context, about state theory, and the response, state is not the question is the governmentality. Second point. If you read this lecture, you can see that Foucault proposed a story of liberalism, but without any quotation of a philosophical thinker of liberalism. The sole thinker of liberalism by Foucault are economists. And I think for you, that is strange, this identification between economists and liberalism. And the sole liberalism for Foucault, the sole interesting liberalism, that is the liberalism practiced by economists and not by the theorician of the political, the philosophical politics of liberalism. And why? Because Foucault gave to the economist a very specific statute, that is, they are true producers. I am not sure that my accent is good. Please, Bernard, help me.
Okay.
La vérité.
Wait. Truth producers. Right?
Truth
producers of veridiction.
That is very important in the Foucault's game, because you can see in the text that the search of Foucault, that is to get a theory, a non-moral theory, and a non-juridical theory. His challenge is to be free from moral and from the law. And he finds, I think, the solution by economists. That is his celebration of the work of your work. That you propose a theory of man, a vision of man, non-moral and non-juridical. And that is, for him at this time, that is, in this project, naturally, very important. Gary Becker, for Foucault, is a moment in the very long story of the truth-telling, of a truth-telling free from moral and juridical framework. Second point. There is a text, a Foucault text, early text, Foucault, where he says, in the 20th century, the philosophical acts are not in the philosophy, but in other fields. For example, a very important philosophical act in the 20th century was the doctrine of the psychoanalysis, or was the theory of linguistics by Saussure. I think Foucault, when you read your work, think economics, on your kind of economics, that is, for our time, a philosophical act. That is a field, a place where we can observe a philosophical act. Philosophical act is very important by Foucault because we are dependent of philosophical act, and the place of this kind of philosophy, that is to identify such kind of act and to be free from such kind of act, to give the possibility on other act in the future. What was, in his perspective, your act? That is to transform the economics and to make economics not only a theory or not only an observation, an analysis of wealth, but to make the shift from wealth to the human behavior. The shift from wealth to value, and to make economics like a science of evaluation. How people make evaluation, and that is a question of value. Naturally, value is close to wealth, but that is value is more complex. And you change the economy. This change is maybe parallel with the perspective in philosophy and in the study of power by Foucault, that is the shift from macroeconomy to microeconomy. I think a consequence of this act, for Foucault, and that is the reason because I can speak of an apology, that is, for Foucault, the liberty is why the question of trust is so important, because our liberty, the possibility of liberty, depends of the manner to tell the truth, or to produce truth. Certain kind of truth are death for liberty, other kind of truth give new possibility for liberty. And ici, your work, your kind of analysis comes like the possibility to promote, to envisage new kind of liberty. For example, Bernard is very interested by that. For example, your work gives the possibility to think the power without discipline, because you think your theory of regulation, that is not, it is possible to conduct the behavior of the other without coercion, by incitation. And this kind of, that is, I think that was, and another aspect, very important, where you are very close to Foucault. That is, for example, in this page where Foucault use your work about enforcement of law. And what is very interesting for him at this, in this place, that is the theory to make an analysis of law in respect with enforcement of law. That means that there is only power relationship. And the relation between the agent and the power is only a fight, a calculus, on absolutely free of moral question or juridical question. And that was, I think, for him, something very proxy, very interesting. So, next point, I propose the idea of an apology by Foucault of Gary Becker, but the question is, Foucault, was Foucault become a pupil of Gary Becker? I don't know. We can make several observations. The first one, that Foucault found your proposition, your practical proposition, for example, for criminality and so on, I think very intelligent, very malicious in respect of what was the common idea. And that was his first interest. Second, but that is not in this both lecture, but before in the text, Foucault tells us about the theory of fiction. I think that is very important, because for Foucault, the man you produce by the economic analysis is not real. That is a fiction. This fiction is interesting. This fiction gave new possibility. This kind of fiction could be dangerous, could be also interesting, but that is a fiction. And that is the reason, because Foucault is not your pupil, because it is very interesting. So your kind of economy produce a new vision of man, in a context very interesting in a relationship with government, with power, but it is forbidden to think that this kind of man is real. He is produced in a power relationship. Where, but the difference with with ideological perspective, that is, your work is linked to the truth. That is what makes. In another perspective, we can observe that what the economist objective like an agent was very close that from what Foucault searched with his theory of subject, of a subject. That is interesting for me. That is, he can read in your work the theory of, in the economy, the agent is always, he decides. And for Foucault, in his power theory, it was very difficult to think how the subject decides. He is decided by the power. And he can find by you a solution. And maybe we can see the reading of your work by Foucault like a step between his first theory of power and the last Foucault about subjectivity and so on. So, naturally, we can regret the meeting in 79 or maybe 80s between Gary Becker and Foucault on the Chicago University of Chicago campus. Maybe because we can think that the vision of power relationship and the vision of the decision in your theory could be very fruitful. But why this meeting was not possible? Because maybe that in the University of Chicago there was a connection, a possible connection between French philosopher and economist, but maybe a difficulty with the Department of Political Science at this time, where the question of liberalism was not viewed in the same manner. And there were French people here in the Department of Political Science at this time, but it was very hard against. They were very hard against Foucault. And that is the reason, because I think maybe, thanks to Bernard, the possibility of this meeting, this possibility is naturally a very big pleasure for me, but also maybe a little mark in the story of this university.
Thank you. Fascinating. Now, I would want to add a fifth and a sixth point that sharpen, I think, the critique and maybe turn it from an apology to a critique. But I don't think I should do that just yet. I think that
I would like to hear it.
Really?
I'll respond afterwards. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, sure, definitely.
Okay, all right. So then you'll have to respond to two different takes, right?
I'll try.
Okay. Just so by way of background, I think it's important to say that obviously Foucault never turned these lectures into a written text, and that's very important. Daniel Defer, Foucault's partner, is fond of recounting how Foucault wrote his books, and he wrote them, according to Daniel, 3 times. The first manuscript he would throw out and say that he'd written everything he did not want to say. The second he would have typed up, and he would use as the basis for the third manuscript, which was the book. So as a historical matter, it's possible that these lectures represent the first draft, right? What he did not feel that he needed to say or necessarily wanted to say. So that should put us in, I think, a bit of a cautious interpretive moment to begin with. But obviously he does say specifically things about American neoliberalism, and they've been somewhat controversial. Some scholars, like the intellectual historian Michael Berendt, have gone so far as to suggest that Foucault had a general penchant for, a general favor for neoliberalism. And of course that is implied in the question at the beginning of François Ewald's 4th point of whether Foucault was a pupil of Gary Becker. I think that goes too far. Though it is difficult to focus specifically on the exact nature of the critique, and so what I'd like to do is do just that, which is to try and identify where the critique might be. I think François Ewald has articulated and offered probably something that will overlap significantly, and that may be actually underlying what I'm going to say, maybe the most important critique, and it is this notion of seeing power without coercion. And so let me come back to that. Others have identified other critiques which I do not believe are entirely correct. Colin Gordon in The Foucault Effect, in an early chapter of The Foucault Effect, I think focuses on the notion of the malleability of the neoliberal subject, and that this notion of the malleability, the shapeability of the neoliberal subject is something that I think he views as cautiously problematic. And he writes, "The American neoliberal Homo economicus is manipulable man who is perpetually responsive to modifications in his environment. Economic government here joins hand with behaviorism." And that's Gordon from Foucault Effect at page 43. So this notion that somehow the notion of human capital or the notion of Homo economicus would feed into behaviorism, and that is particularly problematic. Now, Foucault refers to that in this chapter when he's talking to a certain extent. Well, he comes back to that in on March 28th, but he refers, I think, to that specific danger around page 228 of the English translation of his lectures, where he talks about eugenics, the problem of eugenics. And he says, as soon as a society poses itself the problem of the improvement of its human capital in general, right? So once we have a theory of human capital, and then once we view the important issue as being improvement of human capital, that it is inevitably that the problem of the control, screening, and improvement of human capital of individuals is called for, right? And so that could be kind of a sharp critique. Actually, it would be a very sharp critique, and to a certain extent, it would be a too sharp critique, I think, is what Foucault then says, and this is where I think. This is picking up on this notion of power without coercion, but I think it's a little bit sharper in the ultimate implications. Because on the next couple of pages, on page 230 of the lectures, Foucault then says, what, you will ask, is the interest of all these analyses? So essentially he's kind of pulling back and saying, okay, so why do we care about this theory of human capital? And he says, you will be aware of the immediate political connotations, and there is no need to stress them further. The immediate political connotations being the one that we just went over, which was this notion of eugenics, right? If you have a theory of human capital, it could feed into a very conspiratorial, instrumental vision of how we need to shape human capital. And he says, no, but that's not what I want to do here. If there were only this lateral political product, he says, we could no doubt brush this kind of analysis aside with a gesture, or at any rate, purely and simply denounce it, right? Because of course we can simply denounce eugenics today. But I think this would be both mistaken and dangerous. And it's in the final 2 pages then of Lecture 9, on page 232 and 233, that I think that he gives his more sharpest critique of the idea of human capital. And it is the idea that the notion of investing in human capital, so 232, 233 would be on the next page right here. It kind of, I'll point to these lines here, okay? That the idea of needing to invest in human capital creates distinctions and discrimination as to which parts of the population you invest in and which parts of the population you don't invest in. And so this is where he writes, on the top of 232, he says, only a fine analysis of the composition of the human capital, of the way this human capital has been augmented, of the sectors in which it has been augmented, and of the elements which have been introduced as investment in this human capital can account for the real growth of these countries. He's responding here to Schumpeter and Weber as to what it is that produces essentially the wealth, and I mean, building on political economy in general, the wealth of nations, right? And he's saying it's not just land, it's not just capital, it's not just labor. What you put on the table was human capital. And once you've got that on the table, right, we then kind of make policy, growth policy, based on which populations we should be investing and which we should not be investing in. And so it's at the top of the next paragraph where he says this. On the basis of this theoretical and historical analysis, we can thus pick out the principles of a policy of growth, which will no longer be simply indexed to the problem of the material investment of physical capital on the one hand, or of the number of workers on the other hand, but a policy of growth focused precisely on one of the things that the West can modify most easily, and that is the form of investment in human capital. Now, so that is a sharp, so that kind of sharpens it a little bit, I think, because although it has at its heart is the intervention of power without coercion, because it's not a conspiratorial story about how human capital can lead to eugenics, it's a story about the way in which once we have all bought into, and here's the question of subjectivity, once we have all bought into the notion of human capital, once that is part of our collective imagination, right, it then produces these policies of growth that involve investing in some populations and not in others, right? There are populations that are not worth investing in. And so I think that that is what would tie, now again, right, the book was never written. The book was never written, but what it would tie to would be a potential critique of our current condition in the United States, say, of mass incarceration, perhaps, which represents a particular disinvestment in a certain population, right? Particularly young African-American men from the ghetto who are incarcerated. A disinvestment in the sense that we have completely disinvested from educational programs, from rehabilitative programs, from all forms of human capital investment, right? And an investment in other populations, and this could be the population of, say, the class of guard labor in a particular county, say, right, which guard labor serving as a welfare function, which is an investment in human capital. You can see this through mass incarceration would be one example. Public housing and kind of the destruction or the state of public housing in a city like Chicago could be another example of investing in certain human capital and not in others. And so I think that that is where you get what he refers to at the end of that chapter and on page 233 as the seriousness, the density, or if you like, the coefficient of threat to the effectiveness of the analysis. The coefficient of threat. The coefficient of threat is clearly a critical term. And what it is would be, operationalizing this notion of discrimination of investment in human capital, or not, investing in some and not in others, which does, of course, then, which is, of course, then a notion of power without coercion, because we've all bought into this, right? And so it has that notion of subjectivity, which is in the later part of Foucault's work in the 1980s. So that would be possibly one reading that, again, somewhat speculative in the sense that it's an interpretation, and we don't have the final manuscript, but something that I think would be different than possibly an apology, right? Okay, so that's 4 and 5.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. I must say, it's a great pleasure for me to be here. And I must apologize that I haven't read much of Foucault. Okay, so it's my limitation. I had heard in the past that he had written some things about human capital in some of my work, but I never read them to Bernard until you brought that to my attention. So I was very happy to read these 2 lectures, which impressed me in a number of directions. They're very clear, I thought. I think he had a good understanding what human capital consisted of. I didn't find a clear criticism there of human capital, and I'll come back to some of the comments you have made. So where does it stand in terms of Foucault's attitude toward human capital or toward my work? And it's not just my work, a lot of other people have worked on human capital. Let me make the following comments. And I didn't prepare anything. I felt I'd respond to what was said, so I'm going to be a bit disorganized in my comments as I try to put together some of my reactions to what the very interesting points that were made today. I was happy to see Foucault taking economics so seriously. Philosopher, looking at neoliberalism. When I started reading it, I said, well, from what little I knew about Foucault, and not a lot, I assumed he's going to be very opposed to a lot of this material. And it turned out, at least in these 2 lectures, so that's, my knowledge is a bit confined, but I've listened to what you've said, Professor, and you, and I don't find any change in that. He may dislike certain forms of neoliberalism, but he seemed to take seriously the so-called neoliberalism that was based upon human capital analysis and a particular approach to understanding how individuals behave, both in the marketplace and in consumption. At one point, he says, Becker has a very interesting theory of consumption. He said, I don't have time to go into that here. I think it is a pretty interesting theory. But it was interesting. He had read some of that and made that comment. So it's a theory about how individuals behave under various circumstances. And clearly there are power relationships involved in these circumstances, and power of different types. The power of the law. So he has in chapter 10 he goes a lot into crime and punishment. Again, he does a very good discussion of what the theory of crime, modern economic theory of crime and punishment has to say. I didn't have much to disagree with him. I think he was accurate on what it has to say. He goes also into theory of formation of laws, which I had a lot of sympathy with as well. Okay, so where can we read some differences? Surely he was not a pupil of Gary Becker. I mean, I think that's be absurd to believe he was a pupil of me. Take one of the points you mentioned, Bernard, that one can take the theory of human capital and misuse it because then you have to allocate your investments among individuals. It's true. It's true. That's both at the individual level and the public policy. But I think whatever theory you approach economic development with, you have to make some judgments of that type. How much you want to invest in capital? Do you want to ignore people? Or human capital says you can't ignore people. Basically, what I like to say is human capital puts people at the center of an economy. Traditional economics put machinery, physical capital, and land, and somehow some undistinguished labor. And Foucault mentions that at the center. But human capital says no. Yes, land isn't so important in modern economies, but physical capital is clearly some form. But the really important form of capital is people. And not simply what they are born with, but what either they or the government or their parents do to them, invest in, what we call invest in them. To me, that's something that anybody who believes that people are the center of what we should be thinking about when we think about economies, think about development, either economic or development, that's a liberating point of view. People are the center of the economy. So instead of thinking about, well, we just have you take Malthusian population, we just have a bunch of people out there and we're growing, and you have all the Malthusian negative policies, we want to cut down, we don't want to have poor laws and so on. All that's thrown out by the human capital analysis. And it says, no, people are important. They're not just homogeneous masses of number of people, and that public policy makes different investments in people. Okay. Now, yes, you have to make choices, but some of these choices, I think most people he would like. For example, one of the basic implications of the theory of investment in human capital is there's underinvestment in people coming from poorer backgrounds. I've stressed that a lot in my work, and other people have stressed underinvestment in those people. Not that we should forget about them or put them in prison. I mean, a lot of them are going to prison for drug laws, which, as a liberal, I'm very much opposed to. So, I mean, if we got rid of the drug laws, we'd get rid of a lot of the imprisonment, particularly of minorities. To me, it's very counter to a neoliberal point of view. Or what I call, I don't use the word neoliberal, classical liberal. What we like to say, to the extent I touch on philosophy, is distinguishing between American liberals and classical liberals. And I feel I belong in a classical liberal tradition. And the human capital expands on that liberal tradition by saying, yes, it's important who you invest in, but that doesn't mean you're only going to invest in people coming from rich backgrounds. In fact, where societies, modern societies and traditional societies have a problem is that the people coming from poorer backgrounds are neglected, and they have very little investments in them. And that if one thinks of this as a educational policy, school policy, government policy, individual policies, the problem is, well, how do we get more investment in people who have the talents and so on, but they're at the disadvantage, they're born into poor and low educated families, and they're suffering after a few years already behind in the starting point. I think that's what the human capital analysis would I think, stress. So to me, it's, I have no idea whether Foucault would like that implication, but to me that is the implication of human capital analysis as you, and it goes back a long time. It's in my book that was published in 1964 on human capital. It's in a large fraction of all the literature on human capital, that type of issue. How do you overcome what we call underinvestment in the human capital of people who are disadvantaged? Now, maybe that's because of power relations. They don't have enough power, and they're neglected in society. I'm perfectly happy to accept that. So, but we try to create an analysis that fights against that view, that says that neglect of this part of the population is maybe not only inequitable, but is also inefficient. And so you can bring to bear, economics is a lot about efficiency. I mean, I don't think economics brings in great new ideas about what equity should be. but it's a lot about efficiency. And what it becomes interesting when you can say something that most people would consider inequitable is also inefficient, because you can try to correct that and improve on both margins. And that's one of the aspects of the neglect of the human capital in the people from poor background. You can invest in them more. So yeah, that's more equitable. Most of us would say it's more equitable, but it's also more efficient in a variety of circumstances. So to economists, that's a great advantage. And I would think to Foucault, I would think to the French philosophers, that would be a tremendous advantage. So that's one set of reactions. Now, let me just make a point that is kind of orthogonal to what both of you have said, but still is relevant. If you think of, in general, the French acceptance of work on human capital and similar work, it lagged behind that in most of Europe. The French were late, and I'm not talking about the French philosophers in particular, I'm not talking about Foucault in particular, I'm talking about the French economists. Maybe under the influence of not Foucault but some others, it lagged behind. So if you look at the spread of human capital, started in the United States, and for a long time was just in the United States, and then it began to spread to Great Britain, Germany, other parts of the world, Asia and so on. The Chinese loved the concept of human capital. The French were very late in getting into it. It's only until you got a new generation, and here I'm referring to the economists, a new generation of French economists who are coming to bear now, that they began to see the importance of human capital. Many of them trained abroad for their doctoral degrees. They began to see the importance of human capital. So I was shocked. I'll just tell you a personal episode. I was shocked in the fall. Well, it started in the spring when I received an invitation from a well-known French economist to say they want to have a big conference celebrating the 30th anniversary of my book on the family, which is, Foucault would say that's a neoliberal approach to the family, which it is, a liberal approach to the family. Mm-hmm. Why was I shocked? Because the last place I thought it would come from would be France. Mm-hmm. Turned out I was ill at the time, I couldn't attend it, but they had a great conference. And they showed a lot of work going on, some of it, a fair bit in France. So I think the French economists are catching up in this regard. Now, why were the French so slow in getting into this? Was it because there was opposition from others on the philosophy of human capital analysis and liberal approach to I don't know the answer to that question, but as a fact, I'm confident that is a fact. Sorry. All right, so that's just one point I wanted to add, because and my great disappointment was I couldn't attend that conference. I figured the French economists finally caught up, and I can't go there to enjoy it a little bit. So a couple of other comments, and then I think we should have a general discussion. Some people have said, in the early literature, and I was happy to see Foucault didn't say this at all, but some critics in the early work on human capital, and there was a lot of criticism in the United States, a lot of criticism of American economists. I mean, it was a battle to get human capital concepts accepted among American economists, let alone economists in the rest of the world. And the criticisms that were made at that time was that human capital was demeaning to the human being, that it treated the human being as cattle. Some people say, well, you're talking about human cattle, or machinery, and often Foucault at some point uses a machinery analogy. In fact, it turned out I've used that analogy as well, and not knowing Foucault had done it. It is treating it like a machine up to a point. Up to a point, you treat people like machines, but it's only up to a point. And why? Because one of the basic principles, you took the course in human capital, so you would know that. One of the basic distinctions we make in the literature is that we say, yes, human capital is capital, but it's a very different form of capital. For example, you take a machine, you don't care if the machine is working in a swamp or not, but people do care whether they're working in swamps or not because their capital they have is part of them. So you have to develop the theory of human capital as partly related to the theory of machinery, but in a very major part, very different from the theory of machinery. And I don't see, I didn't see that in Foucault, but I think that's a fact as you look at human capital analysis. It's partly like the theory of machinery, but it's in major part, the whole purpose. I give a course on human capital every spring, and in my first lecture, I say, yes, we can use a lot of the tools from general capital theory to apply it to human capital. But there's a reason why we want to have a separate course on human capital, because a lot of those tools are not really applicable. Some of them are, but some of them are not. There's a very important distinction between human capital and other capital, such as if I have human capital, I have to take my capital wherever I go. You have a machine, well, let the machine work wherever it wants. You don't really care. We don't worry about whether the machine cares about doing it or not, right? If I invest in my human capital, I cannot in modern societies use my capital as a collateral to borrow loans. That's why we have such a poorly developed commercial market for loans and investment. You look at student loan. They've only developed extensively in the United States because of the government guarantee and subsidy to student loans. There's very little commercial market in that. And we say, yes, the reason for that is because of the fundamental difference between human capital. If I buy a house, I can give my house as mortgage. If I don't make my payments, they take my house away from me, as we're seeing all these foreclosures going on now. If I can't give myself as collateral. Now, in the past, under slavery and other forms, you could do that. But in modern society, we've ruled that out for good reasons, I think. And so you can't do that, and therefore it makes it very difficult for poor people who don't have other forms of capital to invest in themselves. So I come back to the issue why we get underinvestment in poor people. It's partly because of the distinction between human capital and other forms of capital. So in answer to the early views that human capital was the meaning, I think economists have forgotten about that now. It is no longer brought up very much, and politicians have forgotten about it now. I mean, you cannot have a politician in the United States, at least, I think in many countries, who can get involved in any campaign without mentioning many times the word human capital. You know, they can use it to justify policies that have nothing to do with human capital, but I mean, to them it sounds good. You're not giving money to people, you're investing in their human capital. And sometimes that's what you are doing. And sometimes you're just giving people money. But it's better to say you're investing in a human capital than say we're giving them money. So it's machinery, and I was very interested when Foucault said it's like machinery, because that's a good insight. I thought he had a good insight into that there. On the other hand, if he had written another lecture about this, I'm sure he would have said, but it's not exactly like machinery, because it is not exactly like machinery. And the differences are really important in understanding the different roles of human capital. Let's say education. What do we mean by human capital? For those of you who don't know anything about it, things like education, investment in health, on-the-job training, migration, all these things are aspects of what we call the human capital. So why are those things so different from companies just investing in more machinery or less machinery and inventories and plants and so on? The theory has some things in common, but they're really very different. And in order to understand those differences, I think you really give the individual more importance rather than less importance. So to come back to my final point, and I say I'm speaking at random here because I'm just thinking as I react to points. The link to eugenics. Yes, you can always link any ideas to some perverse use of it. There's no fundamental link, certainly in the analysis of human capital. Yes, some people have more, some people have less. You accept that. I think anybody has to accept that. We see that all the time. You see people here are undergraduate or graduate students, and some people quit after they don't finish high school. I mean, everybody knows that. That happens in all countries. Certainly happens in the United States. But there's nothing in the theory of human capital, particularly in the liberal, and I'm now using the traditional liberal connotation of liberal, in the liberal view about eugenics, because the liberal view is, you respect the individual. The individual are not simply instruments of the state. Even on education, what I generally favor is you offer them opportunities. As much as possible, you try to avoid requiring them to do this or that. Now, we do have minimum schooling laws, and we do have certain requirements, and I think some of them make some sense. But as much as possible, you try to give people the opportunities and enable them to take advantage of these opportunities. So, to me, eugenics has no place in human capital analysis. Nobody, to my knowledge, who has been a proponent of human capital analysis have ever adopted anything close to a eugenics point of view, and the thing is generally been the opposite. So let me see if I have any other comments. Yes, you said the man produced by human capital is a fiction. It is, but all theories are fictions. All theories are fiction. I mean, I'm not going to literally describe in any theory. I don't care if it's physics, biology, economics, any social science, any physical science, any biological. They're fictions. So you're taking certain aspects of behavior, and you're saying, can I take these aspects of behavior, a very simple model of man, humankind, okay, man and woman. And can I take that simple model and understand a lot of things about the world and then help to prescribe things for the world? Yes, it's a fiction. I'm proud of that. It should be a fiction. I mean, a theory, if I read more Foucault, I'm sure I would find a lot of fictions in Foucault in an analysis. But I wouldn't call that a criticism. I say that you have to do that in order to talk in an insightful way about the world. If you want to just describe in some literal sense, everybody's going to be different. Every one of us here is going to be different. And yet in some dimensions, we're the same. So maybe we abstract from these differences for a lot of problems, or just look at the similarities. So that's what theory does. Theory is an abstraction, it's a fiction, and the question is when analyzing good and bad theories is which fiction works better for whatever problem you have in mind. If it's analysis, it's prescribing behavior, which fiction works better? I think human capital has been a great fiction. It's not been an unchanging fiction. The fiction has changed over time, but it's been a great fiction. So I'm proud of it. I'm proud of it. I'm proud of that part. Yes, it is a fiction. I mean, nobody would deny it's a fiction. But you have to say, is it a useful fiction? And maybe 20 years from now we'll have a different fiction. Will be better. But at the moment, this is a very useful fiction for a lot of problems. So I'll stop here and see where we go.
François, I know you wanted to jump in.
Yes. I will maybe change a little my mon role.
Your role.
My role.
Yeah.
To address to you another kind of critique, I think, which is present in the text. So Bernard used what is for me interesting in the page who quoted, that is Foucault doesn't retain this critics. He say that is not important at this time. And you have to read the last note in this chapter, where it is questioned about Bourdieu.
Yeah, right.
And I think for you,
Which
that
chapter?
is
Which chapter?
So there was the he didn't get to the end of his of his lecture.
About chapter 10.
Chapter 9. And here you go.
Yes, I read the.
And so this is basically a reproduction of what the manuscript
Right, I
said.
understood that, yeah.
Okay, but
And he quote Bourdieu. What I think in a very interesting manner for you, because between Guy Becker and Pierre Bourdieu, manifestly in this time, Foucault chose Guy Becker.
He had good taste.
Against you, and you can, and he gives a reason about the position, the France position in your, in respect to your idea of human capital. That is, especially this is the doctrine of Bourdieu, and it makes that is interesting. It's just in this note that.
I wondered when I read that whether there was any intellectual rivalry between the two, and that's why he used. Was there any intellectual rivalry between Bordeaux and Foucault?
An intellectual
rivalry?
Naturally.
Yeah. that
is not specific.
Let me just drop
Bourdieu. But at this time, Bourdieu searched to enter in the Collège de France.
Oh, okay.
So
my inference was a little bit right.
Yeah. although it's not entirely clear from the words in the manuscript that it's a placing of Gary Becker on. I think it's a differentiation. It's a differentiation of what's been done in in French sociology.
But Bernard,
versus
if I can, I use a joker because I was close to Foucault at this time, and I know what was the discussion about Bourdieu. But that is not fair. That is not fair. But my critique, I think you can find in the lecture another critique, I think for me, much more important. That is about the consequence of your vision, of your objectivation of man about the behaviorism.
About what?
Behaviorism.
Oh, behaviorism.
And for me, that is a question. Maybe I am wrong. That is a good time to make me more clever. So I am afraid that this theory of I will say the thing otherwise. In an economics perspective, the vision of man becomes very poor. That is a being which responds to stimulus from the environment, and we can modify his behavior with a choice of stimulus on what is a government, what is a power, that is the use of different kind of stimulus. And the economy theory give a set of tools of how a good manner to use stimuli to obtain the good comportment. In this respect, the theory is maybe comment dire, the result of the theory is to give a vision of man very poor. we start with the theory of the agent, and we can see, we can understand how people make decisions in certain context of information and so on. And at the end, we have a poor behaviorism. And the vision of man by behaviorism is not very interesting. For me, you find this critique, but not developed by Foucault. But I think that means the danger in this perspective, that is, your theory of the theories of the microeconomy, the danger will be to allow a theory of power, a practice of power, a very poor practice of power, where as a result, that is very poor. I think that is another critique.
Now, in what sense is that different than the question of the demeaning character of human capital, which, to a certain, I mean, so Gary had talked about this other critique, you know, human cattle, the demeaning idea of human capital, that some people do kind of impose as a reading on Foucault, although I don't see it there. But this is different, I take it, than just it's demeaning to humankind, right? Your critique?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. My critique is that is the result is not so rich that we can wait and give and open the possibility for a practice of government, of governmentality, which is where which is maybe not efficient at the end. And I don't want to make a false process, but if you see how the people, for example, in the financial sector, behavior now, you can see that they are used only in respect of their competence, and not with the idea of own responsibility. And the debate after the crisis was, that is an error of the regulator, because we are like dogs in a Pavlov theory. We have interest, we have desire, and it is a job of the regulator to give the good regulation, good incitation that can make that we choose the good decision. I think maybe that is maybe a moral vision, that maybe we can ask for such kind of people also another manner to see themselves, that like dogs in a Pavlov space.
Yeah, so let me respond to that. I see human capital as really doing just the opposite, if I can be blunt, as freeing up individuals. And maybe if I look at traditional theory of economics, yes, there's something of that. People have what we call preferences, and they respond and get some results. What theory of human capital says is people, it's part of the theory of human development. People can develop themselves in various ways. They're not simply, you know, programmed to go down in a particular way, and then you have laws that just sort of can manipulate them and push them around. No, they can develop themselves in various ways. Of course, how they want to develop themselves will be a function of the environment they're in, the governmental and other environments, what other people are doing. But they can develop themselves. So you enrich, it seems to me, instead of saying that the vision of man is poor, I would say the vision of man is very rich in this approach, because you enrich both what people do as consumers. That's why I think Foucault said this was an interesting theory of consumption. And you enrich what they do in terms of their, you know, a lot of their other life decisions that would go beyond consumption in terms of education, how they might invest to respond to different government laws, how they might evade bad laws. I mean, you even, yes, there's certain, I mean, if you have things on certainty, there's a certain deterministic aspect to behavior, which you can modify a lot. But within that broad spectrum, people have a variety of choices that you can take that wasn't there to the so-called economic man before the theory of human capital was developed. That broadened the choices available to people, not narrowed it. So people can do all kinds of things now. And while traditionally, if you would say you were criticizing, or Foucault was criticizing the traditional view of economic man, they're selfish and they have certain particular preference ideas and they just do it. They don't care about anything else. Yes, that's a caricature. That's a fiction, but not a bad fiction in my judgment. But the movement, pushed by the human capital point of view, is to say, no, that's a bad fiction. People are much more complicated than that. They have concerns about other people, not only in the family and outside the family. They can take actions to improve themselves in different dimensions. So to me, it's an uplifting point of view rather than a limiting point of view. Now, how it links to power relations, well, I mean, you'd have to compare with other theories of how people behave. I mean, I think of this, maybe that's pragmatic. I'm thinking about behavior. And I'm trying, I look at France, and I say, how can I understand what young French people are doing? In an environment where there's a lot of unemployment for the low skilled and so on, how can I understand that? Or if I look at the United States, how can I understand what African-American men, young African-American men are doing? To me, this theory, I mean, and I'm not saying I fully understand what they're doing, but the theory says, well, there are a lot of different options available. What we're pointing out to them is, if you drop out of high school in the United States, you're pretty much destined to be unemployed, to have low earnings, to be poor health, to have low marriage rates and the like. That's what the theory points out to them. And when it then points out to them that you can overcome that in various ways. Not you alone, but with the state and so on. So to me, it's a very much uplifting theory where, again, we're putting the individual, what they do at the center, rather than as the instruments of what others are doing. They're the center. And it's their interaction with each other and with the power relationships that give us the outcomes. So I find it very difficult to agree with the notion that it's a demeaning view of the individual. So let me stop there. I guess we're running out of time.
All right, excellent. So what's happening now is that someone else needs this classroom. So we were able to squeeze into Foster 505, but now I think we're occupying. To continue the conversation, though, tomorrow at the Society of Fellows, François Ewald will be there at noon in Gates Blake 303, and I'll invite Professor Gary Becker to join us, but I know he's got a very busy schedule, so I'm not sure that'll be possible. I think that nothing was said that was inappropriate, and therefore that I can make the recordings available to people who weren't able to make it here. And what I'll try and do is get those up on the Carcel Notebooks site or something like that, but I'll send out an email at some point to tell you where you can find the conversation. And I want to thank tremendously Professor François Ewald for coming over to Chicago, and Professor and Professor Gary Becker for being here.